Who was your favorite teacher ever?
That's a good question. So I can remember all my teachers from primary 1 all the way through.
So can I.
So I actually picked, this is like the wisdom of Solomon. I'm going to pick, there's two of my primary teachers, actually 3 of my primary teachers that really stand out. One of them recently passed away, tragically, but Miss Florence was an amazing influence on me.
Why?
Why? She had such a natural authority. It was very softly spoken. A love of reading was a really big thing. And actually moral compass, I would say. I remember every talk that she gave to us about what was right, what was wrong, how to behave, the way to treat other people. And that still stays with me. And actually...
And what grade was this?
That would be in Scotland, primary 5. And actually, she came to my wedding like 25 something years later. So that gives you an idea of how influential she was on me, as did my primary 6 teacher and my primary 2 teacher. So there you go, my primary teachers were amazing.
What a great story. Does anyone else have a favorite teacher they could share with us as we get started right now?
So
Robin, do you mind someone here right in the front row? We got a couple.
We'll do a sweep, this is great.
My high school environmental science teacher who I had for 2 years, she introduced me to the world of environmental science and project-based learning, which was unheard of decades ago.
And here you are today.
And who's that?
Red?
Thank you. I would say my high school geography teacher, and I think one of the reasons was she made a kind of a personal connection with me, and also the design of her classroom. It was very interesting to go into because it was covered in posters from around about the world and different points to think on. So it was always nice to go in there to that different environment as well.
Can we just get one more somewhere? I saw some hands in the back there.
Thank you. My geography teacher as well, when she arrived, when I was in S3, she transformed me from thinking geography was just a subject to finding out it was the subject that linked everything in the world.
I love hearing this about geography, by the way.
Lots
It's
of love for
fantastic.
geography.
Yeah, I love hearing this about geography.
Do you want any more? Are we happy?
I think does anybody else want to share? Because it's a lot of fun to hear. Yeah, got one more.
We missed you, sir.
One of my high school history teachers, and it was because she worked very hard to ensure that students learned how to challenge assumptions, challenge authority with critical thinking, and to make decisions based on logic. And that was particularly important.
So I'll share with you mine, which is, if I can get my slides going, please. I'm trying to click. Oh, there we go. Oh, now we're going too fast. My 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Heil, created so much rigor in 4th grade. It was the first time that I felt when I applied myself, I was getting results. It really mattered to me. We were learning math facts, and there was just a tremendous level of rigor about it. But I also think she got me to raise my hand more. There was a sense of engagement, and I look back on her, and by the way, I could tell you about, like Robin. How many people, by the way, know all of their teachers? Show of hands. It's actually, so it's like 50% of us in here. I mean, I'm like Robin. I know all of my teachers as well. And I come to you today kind of as I became a teacher as my second career. Earlier today, there was this fantastic story by a gentleman named Chris Vanderkaal, who talked about how, as a teacher in his own right, some people came into his classroom to expose kind of the professional experience. In this case, he was working with a supermarket chain, I think locally here, and he had this epiphany as a teacher, never mind his students. He had this epiphany as a teacher that all these business people that he felt so isolated from were in fact pretty normal, and that day he decided to start a company, and he has a quite successful company here in Scotland. I'm sort of the reverse of that. I went to business school, and I became an entrepreneur. I was an internet media entrepreneur for a long time, and someone asked me to come teach at NYU, or guest lecture, I should say. And as I was in that room, I was like, wait a minute. This feels so much more right to me. And I've been able to kind of continue my entrepreneurial career while also being a professor. And today I'm the chairman of a company called Therma, which is a climate technology company. And it's in this dual role that I want to speak to you today about the incredible opportunity that we have as educators to make climate technology just central to the experience, or the climate movement central to the experience of education today. But before we do that, I want to start with some of the stuff I teach. So I will talk to you about this gentleman who's like an incredibly important native son of the United Kingdom. He, in the late 80s, was working at CERN, and CERN has this large international community of scientists who were having trouble sharing and collaborating on research because they'd have to fax these long documents. And he wondered, this computer scientist, if he could come up with a better system for collaboration and sharing. And his name is Sir Tim Berners-Lee. And he invented the World Wide Web. And we should talk about what that means, because in short order, he offered us HTTP, HTML, the browser, the server, and of course, hyperlinks. Those little blue links that we continue to click on all the time, some 30 years later. Sir Tim, here's a more recent shot, is, in my opinion, several hundred years from now, going to be thought of the way we think of Leonardo or Einstein, because he ushered in a staggeringly fast revolution. Let's look at the speed of this revolution, right? Can you imagine in the mid-90s, there were only 10 million people connected to the internet in the world? And it's very important as you look at this slide that you realize that in the year 2000, there were only 120 million people connected to the internet. Well, things have grown pretty dramatically. Consider that there are nearly 8 billion people in the world. 2/3 of them have mobile phones. Way more than half use the internet, 60%. And over 50% use social media. This is how fast the world has changed. It's all happened. The World Wide Web was released the year I graduated from college in 1990. It all happened in 31 years. And my career is really sort of, literally, I graduated from college the year the World Wide Web was invented. So I was very early in the digital revolution, and it's a moment of great faith for me. What happened after I first guest lectured at NYU is I suggested that we form a class that we then called The Rise of Internet Media, which really became the history of internet media. And I've been doing that for a dozen years, and I've taught nearly 1,000 students who've gone off to work in unbelievably, familiar companies to you, all of which you would know. One of the kind of central figures in internet history is a guy named Mark Andreessen, who invented the graphical browser. Sir Tim's version of the browser had no ability to see any kind of imagery. Things like GIFs or GIFs or JPEGs didn't exist. And Mark Andreessen created a browser that he called Mosaic at the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana. And that browser became Netscape. And he's gone on to be a venture capitalist, and he famously said in the tech industry 10 years ago that software is eating the world. That software is eating the world. And I often think that if software is eating the world, climate technology can save it. And so what I really am interested in is how do we juxtapose this revolution I've been teaching now for a dozen years with the one that's coming. So let's explore that a little bit more. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this acronym, FANG, which stands for Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google. It's a sort of big tech acronym. But as you know, Facebook changed its name to Meta, which allows this to be MANG, or as it was pointed out to me earlier, manga, which I think is particularly interesting. Anyway, these companies, just this handful of companies, is now worth $3 trillion around the world. These are kind of our most valuable companies in the world now. But it's important to also acknowledge that there are nearly 1,000 unicorns. Unicorns are companies that are worth $1 billion or more in the tech space. And this is around the world. So in this space of 31 years, 1,000 companies, nearly 1,000 companies have created this enormous amount of value. They've created a lot of jobs. Of course, they've also taken away a lot of jobs. But they've been kind of the propulsion of the global economy at some level, or at least in the eyes of the media, right? And when you compare this tech revolution with the climate revolution, you actually see we've barely started in climate. We've barely started in climate. And the reason that's so important is because you educate the people who I believe are going to be creating these companies. So if you just look at this, you can see Tesla's really the only truly significant climate technology company that exists today. I mean, we have some other important wind companies, but this is an index put together by a venture capital firm of which there are only 33 companies that they're tracking in the public markets. Only 33. We're just getting started. Think about that chart. Early in the 90s, almost nobody's on the internet, right? And it's slowly growing, but then it really takes off. We talk about these two dates in the climate movement, 2030 and 2050. Well, I have news for you. We're within 31 years of those two dates. A lot can happen. A lot can happen. So there's a guy named Larry Fink who runs the biggest asset management firm in the world. And Larry said just a couple of weeks ago that the next $1,000 billion startups, 1,000 unicorns, will be in climate tech. This is the framework from which I want us to start to think about what does it mean for our kindergartners, 9th graders, 7th graders, college students. The world is shifting. I've been teaching a bunch of kids who are dying to get into the digital media industry, right? But they're also increasingly interested in climate, but they don't know where to work, how to go, how to proceed, right? And that's the kind of thing we need to wrestle with now. And the reason I came to Glasgow to talk to all of you today and all of you around the world online is that I don't think we talk enough about talent flows. Here at COP26, there has been an amazing amount of discussion about capital flows. There's private capital, there's multilateral banks. You've heard from many people about how capital is shifting around. But capital is only one part of the equation. Talent is the other part. And that's where all of you come in. This is the future entrepreneurial class. You spend time with them every day, educating them. And it is in this context that we have to begin to think about how we weave climate education into our classrooms, whatever the constraints are. And we all know, as we've heard earlier today, that the industrial education model creates a lot of friction in terms of how free you are within your classrooms or your seminars, or if you're a head teacher or a principal. How do you think about these things? At some level, we bear this enormous responsibility, and we know we're driving to this. This is the whole point of what we do. Doesn't matter how young or old our students are, this is the moment at which you stop being a student, in most cases, and enter into some working life. Maybe it's a professional class, but some working life. So, interestingly, Sir Tim has a brother named Mike Berners-Lee, Professor Mike Berners-Lee. I don't know who the Berners-Lee parents are, but wow. They've made a major contribution, because Professor Berners-Lee doesn't work on tech, he works on climate. He teaches at Lancaster University, and he teaches about sustainability. And he's written a really interesting book called There Is No Planet B. There Is No Planet B, which I encourage you to read. And he lays out kind of a framework, a useful framework for how to think about what needs to be done. And he's pretty provocative, very challenging of governments and the private sector. So Mike Berners-Lee does a good job of articulating why I believe the climate tech revolution is going to dwarf the digital revolution. I mean, let's face it, Facebook and Google get a tremendous amount of coverage, and they've built a $200 billion revenue business combined, 220 maybe, just in advertising. It's a significant number. But ultimately, these are media companies. Of course, they have other ancillary businesses, but ultimately they are media companies. And guess what? Media, for all its importance, is not close to the biggest industry in the world. It's not close. Let's talk about energy. Just the extraction business, taking oil, gas, and coal out of the earth, is a $6 trillion a year business. Trillion, not billion, trillion. That's just the extraction business. The utilities are another 6 trillion around the world. So while Facebook and Google seem enormous, think about the companies that are coming behind them that could revolutionize the energy sector. And that's only one of the sectors. The agriculture business, as it might not surprise you, you think of this as a fairly mature industry, it's also an enormous industry feeding the world. $10 trillion. Trillion, again. And you, of course, think a lot about, and it gets a lot of coverage, electric vehicles and the transportation industry. These are just 3 of the industries that the young people we teach today are going to go work in and help to heal the planet. So, climate literacy is a phrase I've been thinking about. You know, when I was in college, we learned visual literacy. How to watch television is what that meant. How to decode television, right? And how to not be a victim of misinformation or manipulation. Through my NYU career, I've been teaching some level of digital literacy, right? Some level of digital literacy, and it's, you know, just in this brief time I've been teaching internet media history, you can imagine the class has changed a lot, right? Remember that sound of dial-up modems? Remember, you know, like when we used to have to dial the phone, AOL, or whatever, however you got onto the internet in the 90s? Well, my students today have never heard that sound. So things change abruptly in digital media history. So digital literacy is a hard thing to grapple with, and some of the panels today have been talking about that. The question is, what are we going to do about climate literacy? And what is climate literacy, and how do you bring it to your students. And that's something, by the way, if we get some time to chat at the end, I'm hoping to hear, I certainly don't have all the answers on. I'm hoping some of you are thinking about that. But here's a simple framework, a simple playbook to think about. I think the climate challenge allows us to bring enormous immediacy and urgency into the room. And I'm going to sort of demonstrate that in a second. I think there's also an opportunity to create a level of consciousness that, like Robin spoke about in terms of his teacher who went to his wedding, right? Like this idea of moral authority and really grounding people in an awareness so that they realize that their individual actions, whether they're marching in the streets of Glasgow today or not, whether they're recycling or not, whether they're taking public transportation or not, whether they're buying certain kinds of food or not, this intent is very powerful as a playbook. And then finally, something that I know probably we've all grappled with is the rise of interdisciplinary education. And the very fact, in the US now, there are numerous programs emerging, doctoral programs in interdisciplinary studies, where you don't have to be just a professor of history or, but you can do something sort of broader in the humanities. Maybe you're trying to merge big data and literature, right? Or we heard about a bunch of people, geography is a wonderfully interesting area of interdisciplinary studies. I think whether you're teaching second grade or college seniors, there's tremendous opportunity to use climate as a forum for thinking in an interdisciplinary way. And so I'll just give you one example of that, which is this company that I co-founded called Therma, which is a clean cooling company. Now, I don't know how many of you know this, but as it turns out, refrigeration and air conditioning are as gigantic a problem nearly as transportation. Refrigeration and air conditioning suck up between 10 and 20% of the world's electricity, depending on how you measure it, whether it's just business or inclusive of all our refrigerators in our homes, right? All the air conditioners in our homes. So if we're going to, stick to a 1.5 degrees centigrade goal, we're going to have to do something about the cooling industry in the same way we have to do something about the transportation industry or the energy industry. Here's the challenge, though. Most of the world doesn't have a cold supply chain of consequence. In Africa, it's barely existent, and even India and China, which are these enormously developing countries, barely have any refrigeration. Consider that France has 20 times the number of refrigerated vehicles as China. So the cooling world is going to rapidly grow because it's almost a Maslowian right. It's almost a hierarchy of needs, right? Human health, to some degree, depends on it, right? How do we get vaccines without refrigeration? Well, it's hard to vaccinate Africa. It's much harder. People want access to fresh food, and refrigeration plays a real role in that. But here's the thing. If you want to talk about cooling, you can only do it in the context of understanding physics, understanding chemistry. You need to know about the Montreal Protocol, maybe the most famous environmental, frankly, of any kind, international treaty in history. The Montreal Protocol is the conference that happened in 1987 that got 196 countries and the European Union all on board with eliminating chlorofluorocarbons, which created a hole in the ozone layer. You may remember that from your youth. A hole in the ozone layer. Imagine 200 countries coming together and agreeing on policy. This is unfathomable, and yet it was only, 35-ish years ago. So there's a history lesson there, there's a politics lesson there, there's a social studies lesson there. There's this wonderful opportunity to look at not just clean coolie, but transportation or farming, and find your way into the sciences at the same time that you're finding your way into the humanities. This is the interdisciplinary activity that I think is possible. I'll close just by talking about these tech job titles. When I was growing up, I had never heard the term CEO. It just wasn't. My parents were in politics. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and we didn't know a lot of people in the private sector, maybe. Or maybe CEOs weren't so famous. You know, ask your students today, especially if you teach older students, who Jeff Bezos is, and they know, and they certainly know who Mark Zuckerberg is. They certainly know. And it's weird. It's almost like CEOs have become sort of, you know, dare I say, like rock stars at some level, admired in some really interesting ways, you know, that I'm not sure make cultural sense. The other title is CIO, Chief Information Officer, often refers to overseeing technology and data at a company. But I think we can appropriate these terms as teachers. The truth of the matter is, all of you who teach are chief education officers, like my fourth grade teacher, Mrs. Heil. She brought rigor and structure and moral authority to the room. She ran my educational life for a year, and she made a huge imprint on me. And that's, after all, that's certainly why I teach. The CIO part is the other part that I know we all want to do as well as we can, but we get beaten down by sometimes because the work is so demanding as teachers. And that's Chief Inspiration Officer. Chief Inspiration Officer. And here's why it's important. The next Greta Thunberg is at that table. The next Elon Musk might be at that table. Our jobs as educators is to inspire these young people not to go into digital media. Let's stop the kids at MIT and Carnegie Mellon from going to work at Apple and Amazon and Google. Let's get them to work in the climate tech industries. And that begins now by teaching them climate literacy, so it becomes a kind of focal point of their life rather than the screen that they constantly use all the time. All of you are CEOs and CIOs, education officers and inspiration officers. And I hope you take that mission very seriously. Thank you very much. Do we have, we're sort of running out of time here. Do we have time for some questions? We can do some questions, if there are any, or comments. Frankly, they don't have to be questions. I think you might learn more from each other than you would from me. Anybody want to add anything before here we go. It's always brave to go first.
Hi, I teach at an American university in Italy. And although I teach communications and public relations, I have made it an objective of mine now to also include climate literacy as a must. And so I weave it in really weird ways, but I mean, they just have to know. And one of the things I notice is that a lot of my students who are very international are almost crippled with anxiety. They know it's urgent, but they almost feel defeated already. And it's tragic. It's very sad.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to take that very challenging situation? I experienced that same thing. And I think generally, particularly at the university level, it's been my observation that while we do a great, we do a really good job educating people, we do a terrible job as academics in talking about the transition into the professional or working life. That's just not what educators historically have done, and it's particularly at the college level where people are pretty isolated. It's not lost on me that the best academics try and get their best students to be academics, which is not the only professional outcome. So I think one way of alleviating the anxiety, which is not easy to do, because there's a lot of anxiety generally in the world of being a young person who's like trying to figure out their life, is by showing them that there's hope and that there are ways of doing this, right? And I think there's a jaded, group of students out there who are like, hey, it's great to march through the streets of Glasgow, but what's that really doing for us? And that's why I think one of the ways we can appeal to that group is by saying, hey, there are going to be millions of jobs trying to fix this problem. Companies got us into this problem. Let's not kid ourselves, right? Companies got us into this problem. Now, we as consumers, like I've been to an Exxon station. I've been to a Mobil station. So it's not like I didn't use gasoline. But companies got us into this problem. Companies need to help us get out of this problem. Got one more in the front here. It's a little hard to see in the back, I'm sorry.
Hi, it's not really a question, I think it's more a comment, just looking at some of the things I've been to today and hearing you speak about that positive role model for young people and a positive outcome and something to really look forward to. And that whole thing of working together, I think it's really invaluable that we take this on board. Yeah, I'm a teacher, that's my background. But I think working with partners and trying to bring something together to join up our thinking and join up our working is really a way to go forward in this. And yeah, there are messages, there are things that people may be anxious about, and they have every right to be anxious about that, but really trying to take a positive spin on things, I think, is one of the ways to go. And thank you for your talk today.
Thank you for that comment. And look, I'm sure it's not lost on you based on my conversation with you that I think teachers are our best hope. And with that, I will leave you. Thank you so much for today.